Hopefully it's recording. All right. All right. So sorry we missed the first part of the recording in the for the Mishnah, but we'll continue now. So in any case, so that was the issue, is that the blowing of shofar, that seems to be an issue, or perhaps saying this formal prayer. But there are exceptions. Al ir shehi kifuha nochrim o nahar, a city that is surrounded by obviously Gentile troops here, or for a place in danger of being flooded by a river that swelled its banks. Ve'al hasfina hamitarefet bayam, or for a ship that's tossed about at sea. So in those cases, you can cry out immediately. And I think, let's see what the note says here. Gemara argued that the Mishnah cannot mean the shofar is sounded on Shabbat over these calamities, as blowing a shofar is prohibited on Shabbat. Rather, the first thought of the Mishnah permits the recitation of a Neinu, recited on fast, even on Shabbat. Rabbi Yossi disagrees, claiming that although people may cry out for help in times of danger, they don't submit the formal prayer, right? So we've seen that. So he says one may cry out on Shabbat to summon help. That's Rabbi Yossi, Omer le'ezra. You can cry out for help, v'lo le'tza'aka, and not for tza'aka, which literally means, that's really what crying out. Tza'aka is crying out. So you can, maybe a different way of translating it is you can pray for help, but not this crying out, which we're assuming he means a more formal crying out. In this case, the Yanenu prayer. So I don't know what you think. Why one and not the other? And of course, the Matri'in this is the interpretation from the Gemara itself. We saw this earlier, that you don't blow shofar on Shabbat, but the term is used. I mean, the Mishnah is using the term Matri'in, which so far we've been translating as crying out with the shofar, because it's the truah. That's the source of the word truah. So maybe in the original in the Mishnah, shofar was permissive, but over time it's understood we don't. But in any case, why the difference? Why is Rabbi Yossi making this difference?
It might, since it's being permissible, these are okay on Shabbat. I think it has to do with the severity and sort of the indirect connection to preserving life, since saving a life overruled, you can work to save a life and stuff like that. So I think it has to do with, well, you're allowed this extra bit of permission to do it because in these situations you'd be saving a life.
Right, because those are more immediate threats, right? I mean, if you're besieged by an army, what was up here? It was, well, the terminology up here goes. No, where was it? It was. It was on the sword. Al hachera was the term they used, the sword. But this seems a little bit more immediately that it's not word of an invading army, but they're actually sitting on the outskirts of your city. Same thing with the river that's about to flood over. That seems a little bit more immediate, and obviously a boat that's in danger on the sea. So maybe it's a little bit more, and we are allowed to, Doche Shabbat for saving a life. But then we have Shimon Timani, who says, Afal Dever. Even we cry out on Shabbat, even for pestilence, even though Lo Hodu Lo Hachamim. He was a minority opinion. It does say here in the notes, many early authorities maintain that the term cry out usually means that the shofar is sounded. Yet even they agree that in this instance, it doesn't apply. It does not imply the proclamation of a fast, as a fast may not be declared on Shabbat. But according to one reading of the Rambam, Maimonides, that you do declare a fast on Shabbat if the community is threatened. So we have different ways of responding to tragedies or frightful things that happen on and regarding the immediacy, how we respond. Is fasting the best way? Is praying the best way? Is certain formal prayers the best way? But you want to do something, you know, you feel the need. It's like when somebody is very ill and we put their name on the Misha Berach list. I mean, hopefully that you want to do something. So we can't go into the hospital and help the person. We can't, suck out the disease, but at least we can do something. We can pray on their behalf. Okay, here's the next section of the Mishnah. Al kol tzara shelo tavo al hatzibur matri'ina lehen chutz me'rov geshamim. Okay, so in general, they cry out on account of any trouble that should not befall. And here it's a euphemism. They cry out on any trouble that should not befall. It's mostly like, may it not befall the community, except for an overabundance of rain. So you get too much rain, you don't call for a fast or even though it could be disastrous. But rain is a sign of blessing, and so I love these situations in the Mishnah when they make a rule, and that happens a lot in the Talmud as well. They make a rule, and then you get a case that undermines the rule that they just determined. And here they do as well. So here's our story of Choni HaMa'agal, very famous story, and it's even drawn out a little bit more when we get to it in the Talmud. So an incident that occurred with Choni HaMa'agal. Ma'agal is a circle, and we'll see why he's called the circle maker. Pray that rain. They go to him. He's a special guy. He has a powerful prayer. Makes things happen. Pray that rain should fall. He said to them, go out and bring in the clay ovens used to roast the Paschal lambs so that they will not dissolve in the water as torrential rains are about to fall. He prayed and no rain came. This is another thing that we see in this chapter. Everybody's praying for rain, and a lot of time, and then it doesn't happen. And you're like, wait a minute, I thought these rabbis, what are they doing? But then, they have to do something else, or they missed something, and then the rain comes. So, okay, in this case, he prayed, no rain fell. So much for him. Well, what did he do? He's not given up. He drew a circle on the ground. There's the Hama'agal, and stood inside it and said before God, Master of the universe, your children have turned their faces toward me as I am like a member of your household. Or the she'ani keven bayit shlefanecha. Therefore, I take an oath by your great name that I will not move from here until you have mercy upon your children and answer their prayers for rain. Rain began to trickle down. Where's the term? Hitchilu geshamim minatfim. Just a little bit of rain. He said, wait a minute, hey, I didn't ask for this, but rain to fill cisterns, ditches, and caves with enough water to last the entire year. I love how he's being, talk about chutzpah. Rain began to fall furiously. Biza'af. He said, I did not ask for this damaging rain either, but for rain of benevolence. Gishmei ratzon, bracha, unidava. Blessing, generosity. They're Yaradu Kitiknan, and then they started to fall appropriately, filling the city with water until all the Jews exited the residential areas of Jerusalem and went to the Temple Mount, which is, of course, higher due to the rain. So now, okay, I gave you what you wanted. Now, and we just learned that you don't pray to stop the rain, right? Because rain is always a blessing, even if it's a lot. Well, they came to him and said, just as you prayed over the rains that they should fall, so too pray that they should stop. He said to them, go out and see if the claimant stone. This was, the mitzvah in the Torah is if somebody's lost something, you have to return it to them. So there was a stone in Jerusalem where people would go if they found something and they wanted to let people know. It's like basically the Facebook before the internet. They'd stand on the stone and they'd say, hey, I found this, and then people would know that it was there. So this is a claimant stone, but obviously a very big stone. And he said, go out and see if the claimant stone has been washed away, because then you'd really have a lot of rain. Then that'd be like floods. In other words, if the water is not obliterated the claimant stone, it's not yet appropriate to pray for the rain to cease. Shimon ben Shittach, who was the leader of the Sanhedrin, he's one of the early guys in Pirkei Avot. He relayed to Choni HaMa'agal, were you not Choni? I would have decreed that you be ostracized, put in nidui, that's cherem, that's excised, but excommunicated. But what can I do? You nag, you nag God, and God does your bidding, like a son who nags his father, and the father does his bidding without reprimand. After all, rain fell as you requested. About you, the verse states, let your father and your mother be glad, and let her who bore you rejoice. So any thoughts on this story? This is such a great story, and I love Choni's chutzpah and his brazenness. He's that, hey, this is not the kind of rain I asked for.
Yeah, it even starts with, I'm a member of your household.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such an interesting theological approach that God exists, or God is out there to do our bidding. Maybe not everybody's bidding, maybe only special people's bidding, but even tzaddikim, that God does their bidding. I mean, this is what you would call theurgy, right? That Choni says certain words, certain actions, and that causes the divine to respond in this way, in a positive way. And it's just interesting because I don't know, certainly I don't think we think about our relationship and our prayer to God in that way today. I mean, that in a sense, that's the Santa Claus, right? I was good, so where's my present? And we try to diffuse that kind of thinking about prayer. And yet here we have this story, and clearly that's the approach of Shimon ben Shetach. If we look at these stories not as actual human beings, but actually as positions, conceptions of how God works, this story tells the story of one approach, which is holy people can reach out to God, and God has to respond because they have this ability or this wavelength onto the divine wavelength, and they can affect it. They know how to impact this world through it. But the Shimon ben Shetach position is the opposite. Is, hey, we don't do that, right? We don't take advantage, either because we don't take advantage of the divine, or because maybe it worked one time, but we don't want people to think that's how God works. God doesn't exist to do our bidding. God has God's own vision of how things work, or an own timeline. So it's an interesting back and forth. The story, is really deeper than just the two. It's a nice fable, but it's really kind of suggesting there's two different ways of how we look at God. And Shimon ben Shetach seems to represent what I think is a more normative rabbinic approach to
And Rabbi, this story is supposedly happened, no?
Right. So we don't know, right? We don't know. So these stories in the Talmud, it's very hard to know if they, first of all, if they happened. They're presented as real life cases, right? That's what a Maaseh. But a Maaseh can also be a story, a fable. The individuals, right? We don't even know if the individuals existed. Now, Shimon ben Shetach is discussed enough times that one would assume that he is a real personage, and that he probably was a head rabbi of the community. But it's hard to know how accurate these stories are. And Choni HaMa'agal, he could be a real person, or he could be what I want to say, he could be like a Paul Bunyan type character. One of these fabulous individuals who they write stories about. We just don't know. So a lot of times, at least the way I approach the Talmud is, what is the text telling us, especially these Agadot? All we have is the text. we can't really know how real these are. All we have is the text itself, and then we try to understand what the text is teaching us or sharing with us. So that's why I suggest that it's interesting to look at it. Yes, it's a great story. And it's also, if you look at it as if the characters are representative of points of view, it's really interesting to think about what's going on. What are the tension points in the story, and that people were wrestling with in the past, and which we wrestle with today. I mean, my God, there are, I remember when these preachers, what's his name, Pat Roberts and stuff. I mean, these guys say things, or Oral Roberts, right? Wasn't Oral Roberts the one who said, "I've had a vision. If you don't give donate $7 million, the God is going to kill me." All right, does that really is God really going to kill him? I mean, he raised the money, so I guess we'll never know. But that's that kind of stuff where do we, when we pray, and it doesn't have to go that far. When we put people's names on our Misha Beirach list, people will say to me, "Thank you. It's working. I'm feeling better. That's a really interesting way of looking at prayer, that if the community prays, that there is something beyond, the practical aspects of the world, that somehow impact on that individual. However you want to understand God, or this great spirit, or theology. Other people will say, okay, look, it's a nice thing we're doing. It shows that we really care about the person, but I really, I will trust the doctors more than than the name on the Misha Beirach list. Interesting way of looking at prayer. I don't know. I think that's what this story is suggesting. Yeah, sometimes it really works. When we pray for something, it does happen. And it's miraculous, and we can't explain it. But you don't really want to go there every time. You don't want to go to that well every time, because you're going to be disappointed a lot.
But the people in this case were affected by the drought, no?
Right. Yes. Right.
But honey wasn't affected by the drought. I was thinking that why he waits until the people ask him.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting part of the story too. Right. It's not like he's part of he doesn't seem to acknowledge, hey, there's a drought here, I better start praying. He waits for the people to come to him. So that's it. Right. So is he a little bit like Bilam the prophet, right? The people that they're suffering from drought, and they go, hey, go find Honi. We need him to come here and pray for rain. Is he one of these guys who is called because of his skill level, and then we call on him to help us out? That is very right. In this case, he did not pray for rain until he was called upon. And then he comes and he says, okay, here's what you need to do. Bring out those clay, put those clay ovens away, because they're going to get rained on and dissolved. There's so much rain coming. So yes, he seems to be a person who is called upon when needed. And then we'll finish this part. I think we're almost at the end of the mission. Yeah.
So part of Honi's speech is that he's asking on behalf of all these people.
Yes. Yeah, right. And we're going to see that a number of times in the story. In the next page on 20, also a prayer is answered, and the person praying, again, very humbly, I'm not asking for myself, I'm asking for other people. And that may be an important lesson too. When you pray on behalf of others, you're more likely to have that prayer fulfilled, because God recognizes your concern for the other. Oh, and that's actually, now that you mention it, now that kind of fits as to what we just saw about those cities, right? the interpretation of Amos that one city gets rained on and one doesn't, and so the neighboring cities pray on behalf of the city that doesn't have rain, because actually we're all concerned. Now again, Rashi said it's self-interest. We might be in trouble too, or will be affected by the shortage as well. But what was I going to say? And here too, it's the same idea. He's praying on behalf of somebody else. So maybe that's a subtle message here. We are concerned about others, and God is more likely to respond.
Last question, right? Shimon ben Shetach was Cohen.
Was he a Kohen? I can't remember. He was the Nasi. He was the head of the Sanhedrin.
But he was the brother of
let's see. I'll tell
the queen.
He was, yeah, it says the Nasi of the Sanhedrin during the reign of Alexander Yanai. He was it doesn't say if he was a Kohen, but he was the head of the Sanhedrin at a time when the king of Israel was very anti the rabbis. So he was very much in conflict with the secular leadership. Okay, the close of the mission is Hayuma Tanim v'Yaradu lahem gishamim kodem hanetzach Hamas. So here, if again back on this idea of the effectiveness of the prayers, if the prayers are effective and the rain comes, do you stop your fast? And you're praying. Well, according to this is, if the rain falls before sunrise, they don't need to complete their fast. However, if it fell after sunrise and they started the fast, they should complete it. Rabbi Eliezer says if the rain fell before midday, they need not complete their fast. If it falls after midday, they must complete their fast. So he gives a little bit more time. You don't, at least if you fasted part of the day, that's enough. Here again, another Maseh. Maseh shegazru ta'anit belod. This happened in Lod, which is where the airport is today. V'yardu lahem geshamim kodem hachatzot. And rain fell before midday. So they've been fasting, but rain falls in the morning. Rabbi Tarfon said to the people, "Tze'u ve'ichlu ushtu." So you can go out and eat. And v'asu Yom Tov, and make it as a festival. And they went out and ate and drank, and they treated the day as a festival. And in the afternoon, they came to the synagogue and recited the great Hallel to thank God for answering their prayers. So this gives you an idea of when the prayers are answered, how we should respond. Now, the rest of now we get into the Gemara, and it starts going through the pieces of the Mishnah to try and understand them better. And here's that first question we had. Seder Tanita Elu Ha'amur B'Rivia Rishona. So the Mishnah taught the order of these fasts is stated only when the fast concerns the first rainfall. Urminhi, there we've got a contradiction. They bring up a contradiction. Rivia Rishona Ushnia Lishol Shlishit Lihitanot. There's a baraita that says if the periods of the first and second rainfall pass without rain, that's when we start asking God for rain. With greater intensity, and praying for rain is how Steinsaltz interprets that, lish'ol. But if the third series, or the third time rainfall comes, or the third period when rainfall should fall, and it doesn't come, that's the time to fast. So it seems like, wait a minute, you're telling me first rainfall, but here we've got the third rainfall. You don't fast until the third area, the third rain you're expecting doesn't occur. So Amar Rav Yehuda Hachi Ka'amar. So we're going to redo the Mishnah. We're going to clarify the language of the Mishnah. Seder Ta'ani Ta'amur Ematai. When does the order of these fasts that is stated apply? Bizman Sheyatsa Revi'ah Rishona Ushniya Ushlishit V'lo Yardu Geshamim. Aval Yardu Geshamim B'Revi'ah Rishona V'Zar'u V'lo Tzamchu Inami tzamchu v'chazru v'nishtanu matri'in aleihem miyad. So here, remember in the Mishnah, it talked about that first rainfall. Then it talks about if it seems that if there's a little bit of rain, but the plants aren't growing properly, that's when we also cry out. So here they reword the Mishnah to make it clear. When the periods of the first, second, and third rainfall have passed and rain is not fallen. So here they're interpreting rainfall as the three rains that we're expecting during this period of time. But it's still it's the early rains. That's when you fast, when the third one comes and hasn't fallen. But what about if it fell during right away, just a little bit, and they sow the plants, but the plants didn't sprout, or they sprouted a little but changed back for the worse. But they changed. Something was wrong. Something was different about the plants. Because here he's explaining because the rain didn't fall afterwards. It's just a little bit of rain, and then they grow a little bit. They come out, but they don't continue to grow properly. That also is a case where you cry out immediately, because it's no good if the plants start to grow and then there's a period of drought or there's blight of some kind, then you're also in trouble.
We had a similar issue to this the past, not so much last year, but the 2 years before that, where we had that late cold snap.
Yeah.
Where April was colder than February.
Yeah.
And Michigan was, I think it was 3 years ago now, all the farmers in Michigan were just devastated because they had this sprout in February. And then by the end of April, most of the big farms in Michigan lost like 75% of their yield because that just wiped them all out with that. Oh, we're doing great.
Yeah.
No, never mind. Just, that cold snap just killed everything.
Right. It is. And it's what's weird more is it's getting warmer earlier. So things start to sprout earlier than they should. And then, yeah. So that's what they're talking about here. Amar Rav Nachman davka nishtanu aval yavshu lo. Rav Nachman says this applies specifically if their appearance has changed. However, if they dried out entirely, they don't cry out, as the condition cannot be improved. The Gemara asks, it's obvious that this is the case because in the Mishnah we learned the word, right? It was nishtanu that says nishtanu. So why did he have to teach us this? There's no need. We knew that if it changed, we're supposed to cry out. But the Gemara says, no, it was worthwhile. It was necessary for him to issue this teaching about if it dries out completely, you don't cry out. You don't start doing these special prayers and fasting because it was regard to a specific case. The akun. It was a case of the stalks grew and afterwards they dried out. Lest you say that producing the stalks is a matter of significance because it's a little bit farther along in the growing season and the crops might be saved through prayer, he teaches us that's not the case. Let's see what the note says here. The early commentaries concur that akun refers to some sort of positive development in the growth of plants. However, they disagree over the precise meaning of the term. Some say it's derived from the word kaneh, which is a stalk. The plants produced stalks after or before at some point, and then they dried up. Others derive the term from litakein, like tikkun olam, to improve, explaining that the plants showed some sign of improvement after they had already dried up. Rabbi Hananel and others similarly suggest that after the plants had dried up, they once again turned green. So it looks like there's some hope, but in fact there isn't. And I suppose this is partially what he's concerned about is praying for something which is, what's the word I'm looking for? What's the word? It's a vain. It's a prayer in vain. Because there's no hope. So once they dry out, there's no worth. It's not worth praying for them because they're not coming back. Even if it looks like, oh, but they look like they're doing okay, but we don't want to be praying for something in vain. And v'chein shepasku geshamim bein geshem legeshem, right? If it doesn't rain for 40 days between the two rains, they cry out. And the Gemara asks, "My makat batsoret." What is this plague of drought? Now, I think what did I tell you that the Art Scroll used a different term, because drought sounds like there's no rain. It's like what we're talking about, and the discussion, the context here is that Batsoret seems to be something other than a drought. And what was the language they used was let's see, what was it? An affliction that leads to food shortage, because that's what we're going to see the context is about. So Rav Nachman says the Mishnah means that a period of 40 days between one rainfall and the next is a plague that may cause a drought. In this regard, Rav Nachman said when crops don't grow in the one place due to lack of rain, it must be imported by means of one river to another river. This is considered a drought. But if produce must be brought from one province to another province, it's considered a famine. So you can see why Art Scroll is saying it's food shortage, not drought. Because if there's lack of, if you have to bring from river to river, then that it's harder to get the food. So it's a food shortage. But if it's from a whole other area of the country to another, then it's more serious, and that's a famine. And here we have a discussion. Rabbi Hanina said if a seah of grain is sold for sela, but is available, then it's considered a drought. Although prices have risen, there's still grain for those who can afford it. However, if 4 seah of grain, much more grain is sold for a sela, but it's not available, that's a famine. And then we have a kind of a repetition here. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lo shanu ela bizman shehamaot bizol feirot beyokar. Money is cheap. Everybody's got money, right? Basically it's inflation. Everybody's got money, but the produce is very, very expensive. However, when money is expensive, nobody's got any money. It's a depression, and produce is cheap. They cry out immediately because you can't eat there. There's no way to acquire it. So if there's inflation, yeah, it's expensive. It hurts your pocketbook. But when it's a depression, then nobody has any means to get food. And Rabbi Yochanan then says, I remember when 4 seah of produce were sold for 1 selah, and yet there were many swollen by famine in Tiberias, as they did not have even 1 isar to purchase food. So even if you make food cheaper, if people are poor, impoverished, it doesn't necessarily help.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Just a quick question on that and the previous point about having to transport food. Does that suggest that what seems to us today as an abundance of food might actually be defined as famine? We can
that means when you have enough.
Right. We can get food from anywhere in the world, and it's shipped to us, and we go to the store and get it. And I mean, and then all of the sort of economic impact of that, right? Like the people in Tiberias who can't afford.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if you're bringing a lot of food in if they can't afford to buy it.
Right.
So I wonder if those two things are maybe kind of linked. Our sort of international food distribution.
Yeah, that's good.
The ability to buy it might actually look like abundance to us, but might actually be defined as famine.
Yeah, and isn't that a problem? I mean, in America it may not be such an issue, but what if you're in one of those countries, South America, Africa, where maybe food is produced, but because the people don't own, it's not for them. I mean, places where they have resources, but they don't control the resources. So they're shipping food out, and the people in those countries are starving because they don't have enough money to get to purchase their own food.
But it is a problem even in America.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But we're not the food isn't actually always getting to everyone who needs it.
Okay,
Exactly.
so right. So
Yeah.
that's a good
We
point.
don't have a problem with hunger in America.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, and that's good to connect that with what's going on today. Yeah, exactly. You can have money, but you don't have the food, or you can't acquire the food because even if the food isn't that expensive, but you can't acquire it. Okay, here's the next. How much were we on? Oh, we're kind of far behind today. Okay, all right. Let's see if we could pick this up. If sufficient. Okay, so here we go to the next section. So here, the enough rain falls for vegetation, but not for trees. If it was enough for trees, but not for vegetation. If it was enough for both of them, but not for the cisterns. Okay. So then they say, granted, with regard to rain that fell in sufficient quantities for the vegetation, but not for the trees, this case can be found. If gentle rain fell, but heavy rain did not fall, this is insufficient for the trees. And it's possible for enough rain to fall for the trees, but not for vegetation because the rain's so heavy. It didn't come in a gentle rain. But not for if. So you can find this too if both heavy and gentle rain fell, however, not in abundance, and therefore the water in the cisterns will not last through the summer. However, that which is taught in the Baraita, Ella hadetanya yardula barot l'shichin v'lama'arot avalo lezev lezeh hechi mashkachale. How can it be that it could fall enough to fill up the cisterns, ditches, and caves, but not for the trees or plants? And the example is because it comes down in one huge downpour. We've seen that here in South Bend, right? I mean, wasn't that like one day it fell, or in Houston? Oh my God, when they had those floods a couple years ago, where it's like in one day or 2 days, a ton of rain came down, and it just wiped everything out. Here too, we had all these floods because it came down at one point. So in fact, it is possible to have rain for the cisterns, but not rain that's useful for trees or vegetation. Tanu Rabbanan, Matri'in al ha'Ilanot bifrosa Pesach. They cry out about trees near Pesach. Interesting language here. Bifros, I think you had a note about that. Yeah, here it was. Has not fallen sufficient quantities. Where was the term? Somewhere it was said because bifros is usually, oh, here it is. The precise meaning of the term in this context is unclear. Elsewhere in the Gemara, they do use the term near Pesach, which is the first of Nisan. But bifros usually means half, so halfway. So that's what they're thinking the term means here. However, they sound the alarm over cisterns, ditches, and caves that have not been filled out before the festival Sukkot. So again, rain falls in different ways at different times of the year. And around Pesach time, the rain that we're expecting is this kind of more gentle rain, or a little bit harder for trees, but still not abundantly. Whereas before Sukkot, because again, Sukkot is the time of is getting to be that time of year. Well, no, when the you need the rain. If the rain hasn't fallen by Sukkot, however, they run the alarm that has not been filled out before the festival of Sukkot. And at any time, that's interesting. Wait, let's see what they say here, because Sukkot is the end of the dry season. That's when the rainy season is going to pick up. So why would you cry out before Sukkot if you haven't filled up the cisterns? Because that's when the rain should be coming. Okay. Many authorities understand the term festival in this context in its usual sense as a reference to the festival of Sukkot. However, some commentaries ask, how is it possible the alarm was not sounded all summer long? Okay.
Does it have to do with the water festival on Hoshana Rabbah?
Yeah, because that's the beginning.
Right.
But
you need some water to do it.
Right. And also that's the beginning of the, oh, I see what you're saying. So maybe if they were really in desperate need, they couldn't do the water ceremony. The water ceremony, there is, the idea is you want the rain to come. You're that's why we're doing the Hoshanot. We're saying, God, we need the rain right now for our plants. So I think that, see, once again, but at least he mentions it in the note. The term is bifrose chag, right before the chag. Now, usually chag by itself is Sukkot, but in this case, it could just be festival. And it could be Shavuot. I think that alternatively, the term festival means the festival of Shavuot at the start of the summer. That makes more sense to me. And actually, the Jerusalem Talmud says that. But again, he's understood it as Sukkot because Chag usually is the term festival, capital F, usually means Sukkot. But I think in this case, it makes more sense Shavuot. The Ezehu miyad, what does it mean immediately? Sheni v'chamishi u'sheni. It's that 3-day, those Monday, Thursday, Monday fast. And in all of these cases of interrupted rainfall, they sound the alarm over them only in their district. So at this point, they don't get too excited in other areas. If you've had some rain, but you've just missed 40 days, you don't go to the extent that all the neighboring towns start calling for it. But we have another case. But what about Isk? So that was Iparchia, but with Iskara, these are both Greek terms, that's diphtheria. When it has the potential to cause death, they sound the alarm over it. But when it does not have the potential to cause death, they do not sound the alarm over it. And they sound the alarm over the arrival of locusts for any amount. Okay, so we're really concerned. And even over grasshoppers, because once you see a few of them, you know the more of them are coming. And then here, Tanu Rabbanan Matri'in al ha'ilanot b'sha'ar shnei shavua. They sound the alarm over trees during the 6 years of the 7-year sabbatical cycle, when the earth is tilled, but not during the sabbatical year, when one must refrain from working the land. So we're not so worried, we don't get so excited because this is the year we're not working the land anyway. But in the case of cisterns, ditches, and caves, they do sound the alarm, even in the sabbatical year, because then you need rain you need that water for the future, but you also need it for drinking. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, even for trees, though, in the sabbatical year, because they serve as sustenance for the poor. The poor rely on these trees for their food in the sabbatical year. They will lose their means of subsistence if it does not rain. Now, here we have a redoing, another version of this same teaching. It's a little bit different. Here they sound the alarm over trees during the other years of the sabbatical cycle, just like we saw. And for cisterns, ditches, and caves, they sound the alarm even in the sabbatical year. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, even for trees. Even for trees. But then they also sound the alarm for aftergrowth. The term here, matri'in al sfichin bashvi'i, aftergrowth of crops, because they serve as sustenance for the poor. And here he explains it. I know he has a note in here about this. They dispute the Tanaim, this is the rabbis of the Mishnah, whether the alarm is sounded in the sabbatical year only for trees or even for aftergrowth of vegetables and grain planted during the previous year. Some commentaries explain that this dispute reflects a more fundamental dispute with regard to the rabbinic prohibition against benefiting from the aftergrowth of crops planted during the 6th year. Did the sages prohibit the consumption of this produce entirely to people of means, or did they merely prohibit its purchase from one who is suspected of having planted during the sabbatical year. But this is what I found really interesting here. Again, the Yerushalmi has a different approach. According to the versions found in the Babylonian Talmud, the alarm is sounded even in the sabbatical year if there is no rain, as the produce growing on trees and the aftergrowths, which were supposed to be eaten during the sabbatical year, are an important source of sustenance for the poor. However, in the Tosefta, this is another rabbinic text, same period as the Tanaim, same period as the Mishnah. It's an organized text that was put together of material that didn't make it into the Mishnah. So it's from the same period of time. A lot of the Baraitas come from the Tosefta. In the Tosefta and the Jerusalem Talmud, the Baraita states that the alarm is sounded on account of drought even during the sabbatical year for the benefit of others. In the Jerusalem Talmud, two explanations of this cryptic term. Others are cited. Some say that the alarm is sounded for the benefit of Gentiles who are not bound by the restrictions of the sabbatical year. Others explain that it is sounded for the benefit of those Jews who are suspected of violating the restrictions and planted during the sabbatical year, so that at least the crops should not fail. So according to the Yerushalmi, which is much more lenient than what the Babylonian Talmud is saying here, that even people who broke the rules and planted during the sabbatical year, right? That's a big no-no, at least according to the rabbis. You pray for, if there's a drought that year, you pray even for those people violating the rule because you don't want the crops to fail, as well as Gentiles, right? The benefit of Gentiles who aren't bound by the restrictions of the sabbatical year. So you pray on their behalf too. And I just think it's so interesting, the difference, because what's the difference between the Yerushalmi and the Babylonian Talmud, at least from the people putting the Talmuds together? Well, I'm not an expert on sabbatical year stuff because I always find it so hard to believe it exists, that they actually ever did it, to take a complete year off of not taking care of your fields. I mean, it's great in theory, but what are you going to eat? Those rules are only in place in the land of Israel. So it seems to me it makes more sense that the Yerushalmi Talmud, which is put together in the land of Israel, they're the ones doing this stuff. So they have a greater understanding of how this works and how and maybe a greater sympathy for people who can't follow these rules, obviously, and non-Jews who are living in the land of Israel, who they live with and work with, as opposed to the Babylonians who are living off in Babylonia. And this is, in theory, this is theoretical model for the laws of sabbatical year. And so it's not surprising to me that the Yerushalmi is going to be a lot more sympathetic and lenient in the rules for sabbatical year.
Not only that, Rabbi, but does that also suggest your suspicion that maybe not everybody was doing it, right? If it's sort of acknowledging that, oh, and this is for all the people who aren't doing it, we still want them to have food.
Yeah, exactly. That, they're living in if it was observed at all, then probably lots of people couldn't handle it, right? I mean, you're not going to starve to death. So I'm sure that the Yerushalmi is aware that, maybe some people are able to follow it, but some people are not going to, and we're going to just be open, accepting of that. And
is there evidence of different ways of calculating it also? Because that there might be other people doing it, but on a different schedule.
Yeah, that I don't know. I know that I think David Galinkin, very prominent a scholar in Israel, has written about how he sees the sabbatical year as something theoretical in general. Mm-hmm. That wasn't really done. It was something, it's in the Torah, and therefore it can't be dismissed, but that it wasn't fulfilled the way rabbinic law suggests it was fulfilled. But I really don't know enough about about it and the reality of it, how they did it, how strict they were in not there's different ways of letting your field life fallow, right? I mean, you don't have, maybe it's not all your fields, or maybe it's some of your fields, or maybe, what they do in Israel today, they, because of the ultra Orthodox, they import tons of food into the land of Israel on the country's, on the budget of the country. So they can have food raised in other countries during those sabbatical years, even though the land of Israel and most of the kibbutzim and the agricultural places are producing lots of food. But for the ultra-Orthodox, they import food because they want to be strict about these rules. So, and of course, the land of Israel too follows, many religious people in Israel follow the leniency of Rav Kook, who said that what they do is they have this, it's like Pesach, they sell the land of Israel to a Gentile, and they raise the crops, and the Gentile basically owns the land of Israel.
That makes sense.
Yeah, well, exactly.
I could see that because, they have to have a lot of money saved. I mean, to purchase all the stuff they're not growing and to feed their livestock and all that.
Right. No,
So
I mean,
what you said makes more sense.
right. So it's kind of it's a workaround, but I mean, in some ways, it's a little bit nonsensical, right? How can you sell the land?
Yeah, and the Torah itself
Forbids it, right?
says that, the Torah itself says that you'll be eating off of what the land produces.
And then the funniest thing, is that it turns out that there was a story years ago that an Arab who was the go-to person to sell the land for years, turned out that he actually was Jewish. So for years they were selling it to a person who they thought was Muslim, but in fact I don't remember exactly what it was. He had Jewish. I guess technically he was Jewish, so it didn't really work. But anyway,
This perhaps explains the necessity of praying for the Gentiles.
yeah, exactly. All right. Well, anyway, we'll get to good stuff next week as we get into. I think that we should. Oh, did I cut too short? All right. Well, we'll get to it next week. We'll pick up where we left off and get into the two major stories for next week. All right, very good. Oh, and right now, I believe if those who are interested, there is a program through Federation for the to observe Yom HaShoah. And today for 4 o'clock, there's the meeting talk about the building and the envelope study. All right, very good. Everybody have a good day, and I'll send out the material.
Okay, great.
All
Bye,
right.
everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank
See you
you.
later.